Greetings, friends around the world. This is Dr. Bob Thiel for the Bible and News Prophecy channel. I want to talk about food, Russia, Ukraine, and the third horseman of the apocalypse. There's a lot of international fallout regarding Russia's special military operation into Ukraine, as they put it. I'd like to read an article about it, or at least parts of one. The war in Ukraine and the imminent impact on food supplies. What you need to know. Our current globally integrated food supply system and mass food production cannot exist without, among other things, fertilizer. This includes three main categories: nitrogen, potash, and phosphorus fertilizers. Potash is a potassium-rich salt fertilizer that enhances plant quality and is responsible for 20% of global fertilizer demand. Together with Belarus, Russia has a 40% market share in global production and export of potash fertilizer. What OPEC Plus is to the oil market, Belarus and Russia are to the potash market. With 16.5% of the nitrogen fertilizer market, Russia may not appear to be that dominant until we look at the key ingredient, ammonium nitrate, and then we realize, oh, yes it is. Why? Russia holds a whopping 66% of the global market share in the production of this chemical, and without it, there's no nitrogen fertilizer. Now, what about Ukraine? Ukraine is a food exporter. You see the chart here, you can see the big producers of barley, corn, millet, rapeseed, rice, soybean, sunflower seeds, and wheat. Furthermore, the conflict in Ukraine looks to be a factor that will result in less food production from Ukraine. So let me read something about this. 1/3 of Ukraine farmland may go unplanted as Russia begins second phase. About 1/3 of Ukraine's farmlands may not be harvested or cultivated this year as Russia begins the second phase of the conflict in the war-torn country. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations estimates approximately 33% of the crops and agricultural land may not be harvested because of the escalating war. In March, Ukraine President Zelensky urged farmers to sow as many fields as possible to protect the food supply. But that appears to be a challenging task considering the displacement of people, labor shortage, bombed out fields, severely damaged infrastructure, and shortage of everything: diesel, seeds, fertilizer. Ukraine is considered the world's second biggest shipper of grains and the biggest exporter of sunflower oil. The planting season has already begun. Its crop production is vital to the global food supply. Even if farmers were to sow as many fields as possible, their ability to export crops would be severely impacted during the harvest season due to damaged infrastructure, such as bombed out rail systems, highways, bridges, and ports. Also, buyers of grains can barely get dry bulk containers insured to transit the Black Sea to a Ukrainian port because of soaring war risk premiums. And we're already seeing food inflation in various places. Let me read something about Sudan. In Sudan, a 10-liter canister of drinking water costs 3 times as much as it did today as it did 6 months ago. A small package of chicken meat, twice as much. The price of diesel fuel has also doubled, and that of sugar has even tripled. In one of the poorest countries in the world, all this is becoming a question of survival. Well, yes, food inflation is more severe in some places than others. Let me read something regarding Lebanon and Egypt. You could say the majority of the Lebanese population is living in survival mode, said Maya Taro, founder of the nonprofit organization Food Blessed Lebanon, which feeds vulnerable people in Beirut. Weeks after Russia invaded Ukraine, food prices soared. The invasion sent ripples beyond the immediate conflict zone, breaking supply chains and creating food shortages as 2 of the world's biggest food exporters went to war. In response, Egypt's prime minister fixed bread prices. Bangladesh launched a nationwide food subsidy program, and consumers in Indonesia noticed a favorite instant noodle dish went out of stock. In Lebanon, people turned to desperate measures. Some families have resorted to selling their belongings in order to use money to buy food, Taro said. Lebanon is heavily dependent on food imports, so anything that happens elsewhere affects the country's food security, Taro said. The repercussions of war between Russia and Ukraine have led to catastrophic surges in food products like cooking oil, wheat, and some types of grains. Yes, there looks to be less food coming from Ukraine and at higher prices. Yes, the Middle East is affected, and I think this is going to be a factor in the stage of the rising up of the prophesied king of the south mentioned in Daniel chapter 11. Now, wars often lead to famines, food shortages, and or food inflation. I'd like to read something from Jesus, the New King James, Mark 13, verse 8. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places, and there will be famines and troubles. These are the beginning of sorrows. Now we see nations against nations, limited famines, troubles, and we are in the beginning of sorrows. Now, perhaps it should be pointed out related to Ukraine. Ukraine is the world's fourth biggest producer of barley and is also the leading producer or exporter of sunflower seed oils. And Russia, which has been sanctioned by a lot of the world, is second. Now, look at another part of the world, other parts of the world. Farmers in China, India, Bangladesh, Indonesia, and Vietnam, the largest rice-producing countries, could experience reduced output due to soaring fertilizer prices. The International Rice Research Institute warns that harvests could plunge as much as 10% in next season, equating to about 36 million tons of rice, or enough food to feed 500 million people, according to Bloomberg. Chemical fertilizers such as nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium are the most applied nutrients for high-yielding rice cultivation. Farmers have been particularly vulnerable to soaring fertilizer prices, as some have reduced the amount of nutrients to save cost. This threatens future harvests, as production declines could stoke food inflation for a crop that feeds half of humanity. Humneth Bandari, a senior agricultural economist at the Institute, said a 10% drop in global rice production is a very conservative estimate. He said if the Ukraine conflict continued and fertilizer prices remained high and supply limited, then the decline of rice output could be even more severe. This may trigger a full-blown global food crisis similar to the one that the United Nations have been warning about. Russia and Belarus are big suppliers of every type of crop nutrient. Western countries have sanctioned both, which have limited fertilizer shipments to the rest of the world, crimping supply and why prices are soaring. On top of this, Moscow has reduced or halted nutrient exports. You say, well, that's all in the Western Hemisphere. What about the Eastern Hemisphere? What about the Western Hemisphere? Well, let me read a report from Bank of America, related to Bank of America. Americans are experiencing some of the serious sticker shock at grocery stores, but they better get used to it. The inflation rate for food is expected to continue to its historic rise at the end of the year, according to Bank of America. That's not exactly surprising, considering food inflation saw the biggest annual increase in March since 1981, rising at 8.8% year over year. But things may be getting even worse. Bank of America analysts, led by Alexander Lin, said in a note on Thursday that they expect U.S. food inflation to hit 9% by the end of 2022. Looking ahead, we think that consumers will continue to feel the pinch of elevated food inflation, the analyst wrote. While there's been a lot of attention on the shock from Russia-Ukraine conflict, we believe that it's too early to see the impact at the grocery store. Rather, it should lead to sustained price increases later this year. Bank of America's analysts noted that farmers have been grappling with rising costs like never before. The cost of agricultural chemicals, including fertilizers and pesticides, has jumped almost 50% in the past year alone. March's producer price index showed this, and the Russia-Ukraine conflict has only made matters worse. Now, I saw something at the Organic Prepper that said since February, between February and April of 2022, in the United States, there have been explosions and or significant fires at 16 food processing plants. And that's not good for food prices. Now, what about other things? Well, Forbes ran a piece with a couple of different items. Let me just read the first one from Forbes. What the West drought means for food. Dry weather forecasts calls for higher food prices as billions in farm losses. Nearly all the American West is persisting through a prolonged mega drought. So, got weather in the United States, and including in California where I'm at. Forbes also put out the following. Palestinians could run out of wheat reserves in 3 weeks in a ripple effect of the Ukraine war. Oxfam says Gazans will be among the first to experience hunger related to shortages and price hikes due to Russia's attack on Ukraine. Now, in the 6th chapter of the book of Revelation, which is also known as the Apocalypse, we read about the opening of 5 seals. The first 4 precede the start of the Great Tribulation. So they happen before the Great Tribulation itself. And each of these 4 seals, first 4, is associated with a ride of 4 different horsemen. The first one has to do with false but seemingly nice religion. The second one has to do with taking peace from the earth. The third has to do with scarcity and food inflation. In its booklet on the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, the old Ambassador College put out the following. Famine stalks the earth. There shall be famines, Matthew 24:7. And then from the Old King James, and when he had opened the 3rd seal, I heard a 3rd beast say, Come and see. And I beheld, and lo, a black horse. And he that sat on him had a pair of balances in his hands. I heard a voice in the midst of the 4 beasts say, A measure of wheat for a penny, and 3 measures of barley for a penny, and see thou hurt not the oil and the wine. As rapidly, in Revelation 5 and 6, as rapidly as the 3rd horseman appears on the heels of the 2nd, famine follows rapidly on the heels of war. Starvation and scarcity are the natural and immediate results of crop damage, defoliation, contaminated water supplies, destroyed livestock, and unusually high food demands of a standing army, all caused by war. The well-trod path of war leading to famine is an often repeated chapter of man's sordid past. Now, we're not to the Great Tribulation yet, but I do believe that at least some of the 4 seals are in the process of being opened. Now, food inflation is associated with the ride of the 3rd horseman of Revelation 6. Nations around the world are being affected by food inflation, and this started before Russia's special military operation into Ukraine. Now, I'd like to go and reread Revelation chapter 5 verses 6, Revelation 6 verses 5 and 6 from the New King James. When he had opened the 3rd seal, I heard the 3rd living creature say, Come and see. So I looked, and behold, a black horse, and he who sat on it had a pair of scales in his hands. And I heard a voice in the midst of the 4 living creatures saying, A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and the wine. Now let me just say that back when this was written, a denarius was a day's wages. So somebody would work for a day and get 1 quart of wheat or 3 quarts of barley. That was it. Now, that prophecy is talking about rises in the price of wheat and barley. And it also warns about oil. Well, as I mentioned before, Ukraine is a major exporter of wheat, barley, rapeseed oil, and sunflower oil. Now, Ukraine does produce wine, but it's not a big supplier of it. But I think it's interesting that Ukraine is a significant provider of 3 of the 4 food items warned about there will be food inflation or shortages related to the ride of the 3rd horseman of the apocalypse. Now, we've already seen food inflation before what was going on between Russia and Ukraine, and more is going to come. Perhaps I should mention the 4th horseman has to do with death and pestilence, and just precedes the start of the Great Tribulation, which is the opening of the 5th seal. Now, we're getting close to the end of the 6,000 years that God has allowed humans to rule themselves. which will, after the Great Tribulation of the day of the Lord, have Jesus return and establish his millennial kingdom on this earth, which is something we should pray for. As Jesus said in Matthew 6:10. But prior to Jesus' return, as he said in Matthew 24:21, there will be great tribulation. Now, in Luke 21, verse 36, Jesus also said, watch therefore, and pray always, that you may be counted worthy to escape all these things that come to pass, and stand before the Son of Man. As we get closer to the end of the age, it's even more imperative that we do so. This is Dr. Bob Thiel for the Bible News Prophecy Channel.